I never imagined that the cruelest wound wouldn't come from a stranger, but from my own daughter. The day the email arrived, I thought it was an invitation. For a moment, I let myself feel a flicker of joy, but then I read the words more carefully, and my heart went cold. She wasn't inviting me to her wedding. She was offering me a link, a live stream, as if the woman who raised her, sacrificed for her, and loved her through every season of her life deserved nothing more than to watch from behind a screen. I sat there staring at the glow of the computer, frozen in place, unable to process what I was reading. My hands trembled so badly I could hardly move the mouse. A live stream. That was her compromise. Her way of keeping me present without truly letting me in. My only daughter, standing at the altar, and I would be reduced to pixels on a laptop. My chest tightened with a pressure that felt like both grief and humiliation rolled into one. At first, I told myself there must have been some mistake. Maybe it was a placeholder. Maybe she was overwhelmed with wedding plans and forgot to mention the details. But as I read it again, slower this time, I realized there was no error. The words were deliberate, clipped, and cold. It wasn't that I had been overlooked. I had been deliberately excluded. The shock left me numb. For a few hours, I couldn't even cry. I just sat in silence, feeling the weight of 40 years of motherhood suddenly shrink into nothing. It was as if all those moments, late-night fevers, school concerts, whispered talks about her first crush had been erased. In their place was an empty seat and a streaming link. I was being written out of my own daughter's story. But deep down, if I'm honest, this wasn't the first time she'd pushed me aside. There had been other signs holidays where my invitation came last, phone calls that grew shorter, her sudden habit of telling me she was too busy. I had ignored those slights, told myself it was just the rhythm of adulthood, that she was building her own life. But now, I saw it clearly. This wasn't sudden. This was a pattern, and I had been too blind to admit it. I wish I could say I felt only sadness. But there was something else growing beneath the numbness, a quiet awareness that this moment was a turning point. A betrayal this deep couldn't simply be patched over with excuses. I didn't yet know how I would respond. But I knew my life could not continue the way it had. Something had shifted, and the days of pretending I still mattered in the same way were over. And that realization led me to look at my life with new eyes, the routines I kept, the spaces I filled, the quiet that had become my daily companion. Most mornings, my days begin quietly. I wake up to the soft sound of my old cat, Willow, pawing at the bedroom door, reminding me that breakfast is more important than whatever dreams I was clinging to. I shuffle to the kitchen, put the kettle on, and watch the steam rise as the house fills with the familiar scent of coffee. It's a ritual that steadies me. Coffee, one slice of toast, and the sound of the radio humming softly in the background. It makes the silence a little less heavy. I step into the garden next, where the roses are just beginning to bloom. I tend to them with careful hands, pruning, watering, whispering small encouragements like they're children who still listen. Gardening has become my refuge. Out there, the world feels predictable. Plants don't judge. They don't turn cold. They simply respond to care with beauty. As I lean down to clip a stray branch, a memory drifts in my daughter as a little girl, running barefoot through the yard, her hair catching the light as she squealed with delight over the butterflies. I used to chase after her, pretending not to catch her too quickly, letting her giggle and run circles around me. The sound of her laughter was once the soundtrack of this home. Now the yard is quiet, and the only wings that pass through belong to the butterflies themselves. Sometimes, when I sit in my living room surrounded by books stacked on every surface, I picture her nestled beside me years ago, wrapped in a blanket, insisting that I read just one more bedtime story. She would rest her head on my shoulder, and in those moments, I felt like her entire world. How strange it feels now to realize I've become an afterthought, someone on the periphery of her busy life. I try not to dwell too long, but the silence of the house has a way of pressing against me, forcing me to face truths I'd rather ignore. Somewhere along the way, I went from being necessary to being optional, from being the center of her world to being someone she could leave out of the most important day of her life. I want to believe this is just how families grow, that children naturally drift into their own lives. But in my heart, I know it's more than that. This wasn't distance born from life's demands, it was choice, a deliberate decision to place me outside the circle. And maybe, for the first time, I have to admit to myself that I allowed it. I kept giving, kept excusing, kept telling myself that love would be enough to bridge the gaps. But love alone doesn't protect you when people decide you're expendable. That thought sent me to the drawer where I keep my most important papers, my will, my bank statements, the carefully filed records of a life built through discipline and sacrifice. I sat at my desk, pulling them out one by one, the pages trembling slightly in my hands. If my daughter could reduce me to an online spectator in her life, then perhaps it was time I looked honestly at where I stood. Not only emotionally, but financially. I didn't know it then, but that small act of pulling out those papers would set in motion a change I could never have predicted. In the weeks leading up to my daughter's wedding, I threw myself into preparations as if I were still included, as if I still mattered. I worked on a quilt I had been stitching for months, a wedding gift made of fabric squares collected from family clothes and old curtains, each one tied to a memory. Her first baby blanket, scraps from the dress she wore on her first day of school, even a piece of the blouse I wore when I first held her in the hospital. Every stitch was my way of saying, I was here. I loved you through it all. I researched flights and hotels, circled dates on my calendar, and even tried on a dress that had been hanging untouched in the closet for years. It wasn't glamorous, but it was simple and dignified. The kind of dress a mother wears when she watches her only child begin a new life. I imagined myself walking into the church, proud and tearful, holding the quilt in my arms. But then came the email. It arrived late one evening, its tone businesslike, stripped of warmth. The words were sharp in their brevity. I was not needed at the wedding. Instead, a link would be provided so I could watch online. I read it once, then again. My chest felt hollow, as though the air had been sucked out of the room. My quilt lay folded across my lap, suddenly useless. My suitcase, half packed, became a symbol of foolishness. She had reduced me to an observer, not a participant. The betrayal settled into my bones like ice. I could not stop replaying the years in my mind, school lunches I prepared, the nights I sat awake waiting for her to return from dates, the way I had sacrificed vacations and comforts so she could have opportunities I never dreamed of. And now, I was dismissed with a hyperlink. The grief hardened into something else anger. It was not the wild, shouting kind, but a quieter, steadier flame. I began to wonder what else she had already decided about me. If I was excluded from her wedding, where else had she written me off? That question carried me to my lawyer's office. At first, I told myself I only wanted to update my will, to make sure things were in order. But deep down, I needed answers. I needed to understand what I truly had, what I had built for myself, not what anyone else could take. My lawyer, Mr. Daniels, greeted me with the patience of a man who had seen too many family fractures. He pulled out thick files, pages of numbers and accounts that stretched back years. I sat across from him, hands folded tightly in my lap, as he explained in careful detail that my assets were far more significant than I'd allowed myself to realize. I owned my home outright. I had retirement funds that were healthy and secure. There were investments my late husband and I had made that had grown steadily. Piece by piece, the picture became clearer. I was not powerless. I was not dependent on anyone's approval. The realization was almost dizzying. My daughter might see me as fragile, irrelevant, easy to discard, but the truth was different. I had strength, resources, and choices. For the first time in years, I felt the ground solid beneath me. As I left the lawyer's office, clutching the folder of documents, I understood something important. My daughter had underestimated me. She thought she could erase me from her life without consequence, but I was holding the proof that my future was mine to decide. That was the beginning of a shift, the quiet turning of the tide, and it was only the start of what was to come. After leaving Mr. Daniels' office that first day, I couldn't stop thinking about the folder of documents in my bag. It felt heavier than paper. It felt like possibility. For years, I had assumed that my life, my worth, my security were tied to how others treated me, especially my daughter. But now I knew I had control, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized it was time to act. Quietly, carefully. So I went back. This time, I asked Mr. Daniels to walk me through what would happen if I adjusted my estate plan. His brow lifted slightly, but he didn't ask questions. He simply pulled out a new set of forms and began explaining my options. I listened closely, the way I once did during teacher conferences when a child's future depended on details. Except this time, it was my own future I was protecting. We discussed charitable trusts, scholarships, and endowments. The more he talked, the more ideas came alive in me. A scholarship fund for students from families like mine had been a donation to the library where I had spent so many evenings grading papers, even a trust for animal shelters, because Willow had been my most loyal companion when the house grew silent. It was the first time in months that I felt excitement, not just survival, but purpose. But with every signature, a knot of hesitation tugged at me, because removing my daughter's name from those documents felt like cutting an invisible cord. Part of me still wanted to believe she loved me, that this wedding exclusion was a terrible mistake she might someday regret. My hands trembled over the pen more than once. How do you sever a bond you spent decades nurturing? Mr. Daniels must have sensed my hesitation. He leaned back, folding his hands, and then said something that turned my uncertainty into fire. He told me he had recently received inquiries, quiet, cautious ones from someone connected to my daughter. Questions about my accounts, my home, even my will. I felt my stomach drop. He explained that, though nothing had been formally requested, the tone of those conversations carried an assumption that I wouldn't be managing my own affairs much longer, that someone else, my daughter, or perhaps her fiancé, would soon be in control. It was like cold water over my face. I had been wrestling with guilt about protecting myself, and here she was, already circling, already plotting. She wasn't just leaving me out of her wedding. She was preparing to erase me financially too. That was the moment the last veil fell. I had been clinging to scraps of maternal hope, but now I saw her cruelty clearly. My daughter wasn't simply distracted by her new life, she had been calculating, positioning herself for what she thought was inevitable. I signed the papers. My estate would no longer be her safety net. Instead, it would become a legacy for those who valued compassion, not exploitation. For the first time in months, my signature felt steady, not shaky. As I slid the papers back across the desk, I felt a sharp clarity settle inside me. It wasn't bitterness. It wasn't even anger anymore. It was resolve. She had underestimated me, and now she would learn that being written out of her wedding was not the end of my story. It was the beginning of hers unraveling. And I knew, sooner or later, we would have to face each other. The day of the confrontation arrived sooner than I expected. I had imagined that my daughter might distance herself quietly once she sensed the changes I'd made. But she didn't retreat. Instead, she stormed straight into my living room, her voice sharp enough to cut through the air before I even had a chance to sit down. Her anger poured out like acid accusations, insults, words meant to remind me of my supposed place. She raged that I was ungrateful, that I had embarrassed her, that I was being manipulated by people who didn't understand our family. For a moment, I almost slipped into old habits, the mother who absorbs blows in silence, who bends just to keep peace. But this time, I did not bow. I sat still, my back straight, my hands calm in my lap. Her fury did not shake me. In fact, with every word she hurled, I felt steadier, as if her rage was the final proof of everything I already knew. She had expected me to cry, to beg, to undo the decisions I had made, but all I gave her was silence, measured and strong. When she paused for breath, I spoke softly, not to match her volume, but to rise above it. I told her I had protected myself because she had left me no choice. That love had limits when respect was absent. She laughed bitterly, claiming I was confused, claiming I didn't understand what I had signed. She insisted she had always acted in my best interest, that she was simply managing what I couldn't. And that was when I opened the folder I had prepared. Inside were copies of the estate documents, clauses that clearly outlined my choices she had no part in. But more than that, there were records Mr. Daniels had helped me collect proof of inquiries she had made behind my back. Attempts to access my accounts, questions she had posed under the pretense of helping. The paper trail was undeniable. I laid them on the table between us. Her eyes flickered, just for a second, with the recognition of being caught. She tried to twist the story, to say she was only trying to protect me, but the weight of the evidence crushed her excuses. For years, she had believed I was too trusting, too naive to see what she was doing. But now she saw the truth in my eyes. I knew. And more importantly, I was no longer afraid to confront it. In that moment, the balance shifted. I was no longer the mother sitting quietly at the end of her dining table, invisible and ignored. I was the woman who had stitched together an entire life with grit and sacrifice, and I wasn't about to hand it over. She may have thrown me out of her wedding, but I had reclaimed something far greater: my voice, my dignity, my control. Her words grew weaker after that, more defensive, more desperate. I didn't shout. I didn't gloat. I simply reminded her that choices have consequences, and she had made hers. As she stormed out, slamming the door behind her, I sat back in my chair and let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. For the first time in years, I felt unshaken, whole, powerful, and in that stillness, I understood that the story was no longer about what she had taken from me, but what I had reclaimed for myself. The weeks after that confrontation felt different, almost like stepping into a new season. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't waiting for a phone call or bracing myself for disappointment. Instead, I started making choices for myself. Small ones at first, like painting the kitchen a soft yellow, the shade I had always loved but never chosen because it wasn't practical. Then bigger ones, like hiring a contractor to finally fix the porch where I loved to sit in the evenings with a cup of tea. I discovered that independence wasn't lonely, it was liberating. I began volunteering at the library, helping children with their reading. I rejoined a local art class I had given up years ago, and in the quiet of my evenings, I returned to quilting not for anyone else, not for approval, but simply because it brought me joy. Every stitch was mine, free of expectation. There were moments when I missed my daughter. When I thought of the child she once was, the little girl who clung to my hand and trusted me with her whole heart. But I learned to separate that memory from the woman she had chosen to become. And in doing so, I found peace. I realized that family isn't just defined by blood. True family is built on respect, kindness, and the willingness to stand by each other when life is hardest. Sometimes that family comes through children. Sometimes it comes through friends, neighbors, or even strangers who become companions along the way. What matters is the love and dignity shared, not the titles we give each other. Looking back now, I see that the betrayal that once crushed me became the very thing that set me free. I am no longer just the mother who was excluded from a wedding. I am a woman who reclaimed her voice, who chose to honor herself after decades of being overlooked. And in that choice, I became whole again. If you've ever felt pushed aside, if you've ever been told you don't matter, remember this: you do. Your value isn't decided by those who dismiss you. It's defined by the love and respect you demand for yourself. Thank you for listening to my story. If it touched you, I'd love for you to share your own experiences in the comments. Have you ever had to reclaim your dignity after being betrayed by someone close? Let's remind each other that we are not alone. Don't forget to like this video and share it with someone who might need to hear these words today. Because sometimes, the most powerful story isn't the one others write for us, it's the one we finally write for ourselves.